you're watching a Screaming Fish here, people, and once again I'm here for you guys with yet another video, and this time, as you can tell by the clearly very obvious title under the screen, we are looking at Ant-Man and the Wasp. And yeah, you might be wondering why my review for this movie is so late. Well, here's the thing. I live in the UK, I don't live in the US, and the US got it a month earlier than the UK did. So I guess Marvel apparently expects all of us in the UK to just be able to avoid every single spoiler imaginable for this movie for a month. But anyway, that's not the point. Ant-Man and the Wasp is finally out in the UK, and I'm finally going to have a chance to talk about this movie. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do that. To basically sum up my thoughts on the first Ant-Man, I'd say it was a really fun heist movie with charming performances, great action and special effects, and honestly some of the best comedy the MCU has to offer. It is one of the funniest MCU movies in the series, and an overall really enjoyable flick, despite having a really terrible villain. I was already pretty hyped for this movie even before the trailer started coming out, because we're finally getting the Wasp in action, as well as the fact that I just really wanted to see these characters on the big screen again. So, after seeing the movie, I can say that there was a lot of things I absolutely loved about this movie, and a lot of things I really disliked about this movie. Something that I really enjoyed about this movie is the dynamic between Ant-Man and the Wasp. Just seeing these two characters talking and interacting with each other is just a real treat. Their conversations range from intimate and funny to dramatic and kind of emotional. That mix of emotions in their conversations helps to make their dynamic more human and relatable, which is something I think Marvel is really good at doing with their characters. They always find ways to make their characters relatable to the audience in some way, whether it's through jokes, drama, or even the conversations these characters have with each other. Ant-Man and the Wasp does a really, really good job with that, especially in the more character-driven scenes. Paul Rudd and Evangeline Lilly have really good chemistry. One of the few issues I have with a few superhero movies is the romance, and usually that's due to a small or severe lack of chemistry between the actors, but the chemistry between Rudd and Lilly is so damn good that I wouldn't be surprised if these two were actually dating in real life. The romance scenes between these two characters work exceptionally well because I can buy that these two characters really care for each other even if they annoy the hell out of one another. And that's another thing I love about their dynamic. They're not a perfect team-up who get along with each other instantly. There are a lot of times where one of them will say or do something that will instantly annoy the other, which adds a strong comedic value to their relationship, as well as more humanity. I also love the team-up moments in terms of action sequences and how creative the film really is with the way these two work together as a team. Paul Rudd as Scott Lang, aka Ant-Man, is one of the most likable portrayals of a Marvel character in the MCU. I loved him in the first Ant-Man movie, I liked him even more in Captain America Civil War, and he is still great in this film. As usual, he's really funny and energetic, but when the time comes, he's really great in some of the more emotional scenes. I love the stuff involving Scott and his daughter, which I thought was really sweet, and it perfectly illustrates that he's really just a guy who cares for his daughter, and someone who wants to do what he can in his life for his daughter as well as himself. And I thought the way that characteristic conflicted with the agendas of some of the other characters in this movie was just brilliant character building. Evangeline Lilly is fantastic in this movie. She was an absolute show stealer. One of my fears going into this movie was that this film would focus too much on her character in an attempt to make her steal the show, but they kept the focus between her and Ant-Man pretty even, which helped the film to feel more like a proper team-up movie instead of just Ant-Man 2, or in this case, The Wasp, also starring Ant-Man. Yay. She had some of the most creative action sequences in the movie, and she was just a straight up badass from start to finish. She ended up being my favourite character walking out of this movie. But with that said, she was also exceptional in the more dramatic and emotional scenes, and she even had some really funny lines, a lot of which really stuck the landing. Michael Douglas was also a highlight in this movie. I still think he gives one of the best performances, and he also has one of the most fascinating backstories in the MCU. I would actually pay money to see a prequel film about a young Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne in their early days of being superheroes. That would be amazing if done right. Hannah John Kamen was pretty good as the main villain goes. She is definitely a much better villain than Yellow Jacket from the first film. Her motivations are more understandable, she's much more intimidating, and her powers and skill set are much cooler. But with that said, she just feels like yet another average MCU villain. Her motives and backstory do pique my interest, but I thought the way those things were revealed to us was both extremely lazy and kind of rushed. And I really wish they had taken more time to develop this character, because the scene where she's introduced is awesome. It's honestly one of the coolest villain reveals I've seen in a while. Lawrence Fishburne is so ridiculously underutilized in this movie that after his first couple of appearances in the movie, I completely forgot he was even in it. I really think he should have been one of the main characters in this movie, but he's barely in it. He also makes a decision later in the film that completely contradicts everything that was established about him previously, so that made me think either something that shouldn't have been cut out was cut out, or they just completely forgot to write that scene altogether. Michael Pena was great in this movie. He was once again the funniest part of this movie. Louisa's stories were arguably the most memorable thing that came out of the first Ant-Man movie, and just hearing that music gear up just had me smiling like a madman. Walton Goggins was pretty entertaining, but really he just came off as a really generic side villain who didn't really do too much else other than service the plot, and Michelle Pfeiffer was brilliant in this movie, but that's all I want to say about her for now because I don't want to spoil anything for you guys who haven't seen this movie yet. Similar to the first Ant-Man and many of the other MCU movies, this movie is pretty darn funny. To be completely honest though, I didn't think the comedy was quite as effective as it was in the first Ant-Man, but on the whole, it did what it was meant to do. It made me chuckle 75% of the time, even if a few of the jokes didn't always land. The funniest moments often came from the dynamic between Scott and Hope as well as Louisa's stories, but there were also some smaller scenes that had me chuckling. My biggest problem with this movie is unfortunately the story. I do like that this was a more personal story on a smaller scale, kinda like Winter Soldier in that regard, and it's easy enough to follow, but that's the problem. This movie plays it so safe that it becomes predictable and kind of generic, and that feeling of just seeing everything before it took place just chased me throughout a large proportion of this movie. Considering Phase 3 of the MCU has brought us films like Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Black Panther, and even Avengers Infinity War, which all took new and different directions with their stories, dealt with challenging themes, and essentially took risks, it's kind of disappointing to see an MCU movie that just trades all that for a safe and mostly predictable plot that doesn't take any risks. I also feel that this is one of the few MCU movies I wouldn't consider essential viewing. Don't get me wrong, there is setup for Avengers 4, a lot of which really fascinated me, but that's the problem. Aside from the Avengers 4 setup, this movie just kind of feels like filler. Aside from a couple of elements, like introducing Wasp, I can't see a lot of the events that transpire in this movie to be important in the grand scheme of things. For example, there's this sequence that takes place in a school, and while the comedy in the sequence was decently funny, it didn't actually feel like a necessary inclusion to the story. It just felt like a scene that they just needed to put in this movie just to fill the runtime, and that's what quite a few of the scenes in this movie felt like, in particular the side plot involving Walton Goggins' character. The story isn't all bad. I loved the Quantum Realm. It was absolutely beautiful to look at, and it was just truly fascinating to me. I wanted them to explore this place more than they did though. Yes, I know we're probably going to see it more in Avengers 4, but still, I would have loved to have seen more exploration of this world. But beyond setting up Avengers 4 and just putting all the pieces in place for the events of that movie to take place, this movie didn't really feel like it justified its existence beyond being a filler story that for a large part of its runtime doesn't really feel all that important in the grand scheme of things. My feeling is that when Avengers 4 is out, I won't look at this film as an important chapter in the franchise like I do a lot of the other films in this universe. Instead, I'll just look at it as a story that doesn't really have that much significance. I say that in terms of significance, it's on par with films like Iron Man 2 or Avengers Age of Ultron, meaning that you only have to watch it to get certain parts of the next few movies. However, just to reiterate, I didn't hate this movie. Most of the action sequences really entertained me. There's so much you can do with the concept of shrinking and growing things, and this film takes full advantage of that. A lot of the action sequences are really creative and have a very cool visual flair to them. That's when the movie is at its best, where there's all this crazy size manipulation in the action as well as some pretty cool elements that feel like they're straight out of a comic book. The effects, for the most part, are pretty great. I didn't notice anything that looked completely fake or anything that took me out of the movie completely. It all looks great. The third act of this movie was easily the best part. It has a really entertaining car chase as well as some really cool size manipulation action sequences, and it had probably the most emotionally investing parts of the film. Although something happens near the end of this movie that just feels like the director just expected every single member of the audience to have read the comics and immediately realize what's going on. But the fans of this franchise like me who haven't read the comics won't know what the heck that was, and I fear that for quite a few people like myself it will be a really confusing moment in the movie. There is fun to be had with Ant-Man and the Wasp, but I really didn't think it was all that great. I still enjoy these characters and I can't wait to see them pop up in the future, but this film just didn't really give itself a reason to exist other than just being a filler story that doesn't really have any significance. And also giving us a reason as to why Ant-Man and the Wasp weren't in Infinity War. In fact, looking back, I think I enjoyed this movie a lot less than I did the first one. Ant-Man and the Wasp gets a 6.5 out of 10. So, guys, those are my thoughts on Ant-Man and the Wasp. I do hope you enjoyed this video. You can watch this movie and have fun. There are some really enjoyable sequences, the performances are great, and there are some pretty funny jokes. But on the whole, I didn't think this movie was all that great, and it could have been so much better, in my opinion. But, oh well, we all have our own opinions, which is why I'm going to ask you, what did you think about Man and the Wasp? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was bad? Did you think it was somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will indeed see you guys in the next one. But before I go, I would just like to ask you to not forget to like, subscribe if you want, and also if you want, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and yeah, that's about it. So, once again, I'll see you guys in the next one, and yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah. Bye!